Hi everybody, this is Matthew Poes with Poes Acoustics, and in this video I'm going to cover the 3 most common home theater mistakes that I see made. And these are mistakes that I often have to deal with either with helping to direct the client in a different direction or advising to go differently, or in some cases we just kind of butt heads on these issues. So the first one I want to make a point about is buying equipment that's based on the hottest trends of what you see going on online or in reviews without considering the needs of your system. So one of the things that happens very, very frequently, and I think people do this for their own systems when they're just buying, for instance, they go to a retailer like Audio Advice, they go online, they look at the stuff, they buy it, and they install it themselves. Totally fine to do that. The issue is that you still want to be taking the same kinds of design choices that professional designers would do when putting together a theater, which is that you pick equipment that will ultimately meet your end requirements. And the end requirements are not typically going to be something like a feature set or that it's the hot new product. It's going to be something like it's going to give you immersive surround sound in a certain volume of room that hits a certain volume level with a certain level of sound quality. So all of those certain requirements basically mean you have to pick certain speakers, certain amplifiers in terms of the amount of power it can produce, and a processor that meets your surround sound needs. That could include some functionality, but that may not be, for instance, again, the hottest product on the market. It may be something else. So what happens is folks go on the forums and say, what is the projector that everybody buys right now? Or what is the receiver or processor? What is the receiver or processor that's the hottest on the market? Or they will try to figure out what's the best speakers that everybody's talking about without really considering what their own needs are or what their interests are. And so the speakers are actually a big one. I'll just mention that. One of the problems we run into with speakers is that they're good sounding speakers and they perform well, but for the size of the room, they're the wrong speaker. And I'm not actually referring to speakers being too big for too small of a room. That's rarely an issue. It could be, but it would have to be a really big speaker, and that's not usually what we deal with. It's people putting speakers that are actually not capable of high enough output into too big of a room. Now, admittedly, these rooms would have to be pretty big for this to be an issue. But what I'd say is, based on the testing that we've seen or done ourselves on a lot of speakers on the market, there are quite a few speakers, and this could even be true of a full-size tower, that are not capable of producing that 105 decibels, which is a reference level, at a listening position in a room, and this has to be true for each of the left, center, and right speakers. The surrounds are done as a group, so it would have to be all of them together would hit that 105. But for the left, center, and right, you're talking about 105 at the listening position for each speaker on its own, and they need to be able to do this given a certain volume of room and listening distance. So when you get into rooms that are in the neighborhood of 3,000 to 4,000 cubic feet, and you get into rooms where the listening position is somewhere in the neighborhood of, let's say, 10 to 12 feet, maybe even 15 feet, there actually are not a lot of speakers that could hit reference levels in that room. By the time you hit that level, you start looking at pretty high-end speakers that cost a bit more money. In the old days, we would rely on THX, and we still have THX ratings, but there aren't as many products today that are THX rated as there used to be. So if you're not interested in one of those THX products, then what do you go by? One of the other ways you could do it is you could take the sensitivity of the speaker and you could figure out how many extra decibels you get based on its max power handling, and then you could add some gain for room gain. The problem is, how much gain you add for room gain depends heavily on the RT60 of the room, so the acoustics of the room, which you probably aren't going to know. And we're also assuming that the sensitivity is correctly spec'd, it's usually not, and that the power handling is correctly spec'd, also usually not. So you end up with a lot of speakers that on paper seem like they should be able to hit reference levels in your room and then actually can't. So again, people undersizing the products, not getting the equipment they really need. But it ends up being something that reviewed well or looked good on paper. Now, another one that we deal with, the second issue I'm going to mention is a common mistake, would be throwing good money after bad, trying to fix something without actually addressing the root cause. And often it's because that root cause is something that's more difficult to fix. So it's easy to buy new speakers, for instance. It's hard to figure out what's wrong with the acoustics that could be affecting the sound quality of those speakers and fix that instead. And that actually ends up being often the issue we deal with. So I get clients actually fairly frequently who will say, I have this system. I have really good speakers, really good amplifier, really good processor. I have this room, I've treated it myself, I bought these products, I called, you know, a certain acoustics company up and they told me to buy this, it would fix it, and I bought those, I put it in the room, and it's no good. I think I need a new processor with better EQ. And frequently when I hear that, my first thought is, I don't really want you to spend money on a new processor with new fancy EQ, given what you've told me, because I have a strong suspicion that the problem is room acoustics. And in many cases, we have the opportunity to measure those rooms and look at it, and yes, we find that there are serious problems with the acoustics in the room, and that even though treatment was put in there, it was either the wrong treatment or in many cases just not enough. So you've got a room that has a very high RT60. It's a lot of living rooms too, which are kind of serving as dual purpose in modern homes, have tall ceilings, maybe vaulted ceilings. They may be very large, 20, 30 feet in each dimension potentially in some of these larger rooms. And you get RT60 times that are in the neighborhood of 2 seconds, 1 to 2 seconds, which is way too high. We want it below half a second. We really want it at like 0.3 to 0.35 seconds. So if we're looking at 1 to 2 seconds, way too high, then we've got a bunch of problems. One of which is that, again, most speakers probably aren't going to work well in that room. And two, we have an acoustics problem that's actually affecting the sound quality of those speakers. It's making things like voices hard to understand. And people are trying to spend more money on fancy processing, hoping to fix it, because at the end of the day, they don't want to do the acoustics. Now, again, it's either because it's hard to fix, it's just a more challenging problem to understand how to fix, or very frequently when I see either not enough acoustic treatment or none at all, it's an aesthetics issue. They don't want to put acoustic panels on the walls because they're ugly. And I have to say, most acoustic panels on the wall are ugly, but there are solutions. There's things like fabric wall systems, which can actually be done in a way that looks basically like a painted wall, or would at least blend in and not be that noticeable. There are acoustic panels that look like art prints. There's actually some really nice ones. There's a company called Snow Sound that I deal with that has some really cool looking art prints. They're more expensive, and that's too expensive. There are cheaper options where you can get them printed as a wrapped canvas style. Point is, there are ways to do it that aren't ugly. You can add absorption into a room, and at the end of the day, that's probably the better place to spend money than more speakers, or better processing. The last one is too many channels and not a good enough quality. This is something I see all the time. So I understand there's something to be said for being able to brag and to say, I have the latest and greatest. I've got a 12.4.9 system, or I have, or even more than that, or whatever it is. I've had some clients come to me and they say, I want a DTS:X Pro system. And then they tell me the size of their room, and we're talking about something that's like 12 by 16, or even, for that matter, like the size of my room, 16 by 20, with 8-foot to 10-foot ceilings. Well, DTS:X Pro wasn't designed for rooms that small. And that number of speakers ends up putting the basically aperture between the speakers at way too low of an angle. When we're talking in front of us, left, center, right, as well as wides, actually might be okay. You might be able to hear the improved resolution of that. I say might because I know of zero research that's ever looked at that, and I question how true that is, but it's possible. Once we start to get to our sides, behind us, and overhead, our angular resolution in our hearing is so bad that when speakers are that close together, the aperture is that small, you can't hear that anymore. And so what's happening is that as the pans are taking place, those extra speakers aren't actually serving any benefit. They're not improving our angular resolution in terms of what we hear from the pan. It's not like better and more consistent, we're not more enveloped. All we've done is wasted money. So the problem is most people are not actually wasting money. They've set a speaker budget that's as much as they're going to spend. That's all they're going to spend. And so by choosing to go with a significantly higher channel count, they've actually had to go to a cheaper speaker than they could have otherwise. Now, I've had people argue with me on this point and say, well, I did go with a cheaper speaker, but it was already one of the best speakers you can buy, and spending more money would have not gotten a better speaker, therefore all I did was make the system better overall. Not likely to be true. It would depend quite a bit, but I'll just mention the speakers that I'm a big fan of. I sell them. I use them myself in my system, and as many of you may know from the reviews or the measurements that you can see for yourself, Perlisten sells some of the best measuring speakers on the market. The S series, which is their top of the line series, tends to measure better and sound better than the R series. Not substantially so, but it is better. They cost more money, about twice as much money. Now, we could argue that the R series is 90% as good as the S series. I think that's a fair argument. The R series is not cheap. So if we were to go from a standard, let's say Dolby Atmos setup that's 7 bed layers, 4 overheads, and then you have the 1 LFE, you might have 4 subwoofers, but not the point for this discussion. To move that up to like a DTSX Pro type setup, or even just a higher channel count version of Atmos, where we've got, let's say, 6 overhead speakers, 12 plus in the base layer, maybe we have a mid layer again, we've added some, let's just say for the sake of argument, we've added 10 channels. Using the Perlisten S series, that's about $40,000 extra. That's a lot of money. A lot of people wouldn't do that, and so they're going to actually cut their budget by $40,000 by just simply going to a much cheaper speaker. Now, if you were to do that with the R series instead, you're still looking at about $20,000 extra. Again, a lot of money. So just to go from the R series to the S series to the R series actually doesn't save you enough money. So again, people tend to go even cheaper yet. And by the time they've moved into something else that's even cheaper yet, what they've actually done is moved into a significantly inferior speaker whose sound quality is compromised. Well, whatever improvement you got from the higher channel count, which again is probably non-existent, has now been lost to the fact that the speakers themselves sound significantly worse and may not even meet your needs anymore. So that's a mistake. People really should be sticking to the lowest channel count that they need to get the job done and then spending that money on better speakers, period. And in many of these smaller rooms, anything that's basically in that neighborhood of around 3,500 cubic feet or less, probably they're fine with 7 to 9 base layers. I actually have no problem with adding wides. I think that's fine in a lot of systems. So I would just say 9 base layer channels. I would not probably do a DTSX Pro setup with that middle layer of speakers. I don't think that that's necessary. And then sure, you want to add the 4 overheads, not 6, but 4. I think that's fine. And if you want to have one in the middle, like a Voice of God, which DTSX also supports, that's okay too. That's not a big deal. But getting into even higher channel counts, a middle layer, it's really not necessary and not really audible in a room of that size. And like I said, is going to cause compromises. So my recommendation is to really stick with the minimum number of channels you need to get the job done and then buy better speakers. It's really a much better use of your money and it's going to make you happier. So again, this is the 3 things that I think are the most common mistakes I see made in home theaters. It's buying equipment based on what are the hot trends rather than focusing on equipment that best meets your needs. Throwing good money after bad by not really addressing the root cause of the problem you're having, which again often is acoustics in the room. And then too many channels that compromises the quality of the speakers. So I hope this was helpful, and I hope you listen to my advice, because I actually think it's really, these are common mistakes, and it really is helpful. And keep listening, because I got more to share.